And we're live. Good evening, good day, good morning, good night, whatever the time zone you're in. I've been doing this all day. And welcome to the ending key panel of this DDDDD conference. And I'm honored to have these four guests here in front of me. Well, they are not getting any closer in these times. So yeah, would any one of you like to start and introduce yourself really quick before we introduce the topic? So we like
this
to
is
start.
where we do the awkward, like who's going to go first, right?
Well, you started talking, so you, Paul.
Okay, it's me. All right. So I'm Paul Rayner. I run the Explore DDD conference here in the US, which will likely to be virtual this year once we figure that out, and have been teaching DDD and consulting for a while. And I'm going to contribute to the show and tell. I also play guitar, and this is my little show and tell thing for today. One of my students in one of my classes made this for me, so that's me. I'm Paul. I'll put that back. Rebecca, go next, Rebecca.
Oh, okay. So I'm sure I'll go next. So yeah, I'm Rebecca Werfsbrock. Back in the last millennia, I wrote a book about object design and got to know Eric Evans, and I actually reviewed his book before it was published and gave him a lot of input. And so I've cared about design forever. And currently now a couple of things that I do are I'm manager of the experience reports for the Agile Alliance. And that's where people talk about experience. So that's where I got to know Woody from, actually. He gave his very first report on mob programming, and life has never been the same since, right, Woody? Anyway, and my thing these days is, besides patterns, is about heuristics for being successful at design and changing the world. So my little introduction is I have a pair of Dutch shoes. So a gift from a friend of mine who lives in the Netherlands. So that's a nod to Kenny there. But you didn't give this to me. It was one of my pattern friends.
You must have really small feet.
Yeah, it's a little, I don't know what you're supposed to do with them.
Yeah.
Well, go in order. Woody, you would be next.
Okay. So I'm Woody Zool, and my main interest is programming. I've loved to program. Once I learned how back in the very early 80s, it became consuming to me. And so I've continued with it through all these years. But I must say that I've always noticed how difficult things become. When you start in on working on something that's easy, and as you move forward, it gets harder and harder. And so I'm always looking for ways to keep it easy. Let's always make it easy. So day to day, we can work just as fast today as we did yesterday, because we're keeping things simple and straightforward and sustainable. And I think I will share a drawing. This is from my wife, Andrea. I'm going to hold it up in such a way that you can see it pretty good. There you go. That's a little hummingbird there. And I really
That's lovely.
That. And I want to say, everybody here I've met in person somewhere, everybody on this panel. It's really amazing.
Some you've been in our homes.
Yeah, I've been in some of your homes. So we'll talk about that later. There's some good stories there. So there you go.
And
so
I've
Julie,
been in Paul's home.
You're the last one.
And last but not least, interestingly, I feel like a relative newcomer to domain-driven design in this group of people. I'm Julie Lerman. I have been programming for over 30 years, and I do a lot of work in the .NET space and have evolved to domain-driven design. Was a funny route to that, but I was fortunate enough to meet Eric a bunch of years ago and be exposed to his work, and it all just made so much sense to the way I've always worked and interacted with clients. And I've been, I work, these days I work most often as a coach to software teams that are usually moving from legacy software to rethinking things as they create new versions or bring new business ideas into their software. So as they modernize. And oh, my little show and tell is actually related to Eric. It was from a DDD summit. I don't know if you can see this, a DDD summit in, oh my gosh, was it 7 years ago in Maine? And I got my very own mug, DDD mug.
I remember that.
Nice.
Great. So I'll do a quick show and tell, which is this sticky. It's actually written by my wife.
Oh, yay.
She hanged it here and I just keep it hanging. So great. So the topic of today is experimentations in design. So Rebecca, you came up and say, well, let's discuss how experimentation makes us life better as engineers to create a sustainable, flexible design, which is a big idea in mobbing. Just don't crank out products like a feature factory. We make our lives better as we go. So can you go on a bit more about what you
Sure. I think that, some of the people listening may or may not be familiar with DDD, more or less. I mean, Julie says, oh, you're a newcomer, but you teach a course on Pluralsight to newcomers, so you really aren't a newcomer. But then there are also people that really care about design and sustainable development who may not know all of the DDD jargon. And I might put Woody in that category. Is that a fair statement?
Sure,
I mean,
sure.
Yeah. And then there are those of us who, I've bounced around for a long time doing software implementation and design. And one of the things that is really hard is that when you get locked into a way of working, you just keep doing it the same old way, okay? And what intrigues me about the DDD community, as well as my object design roots, as well as the mentality of mob programming, is we don't just blindly do things the same old way. What we're really trying to do is to find meaning, and we're trying to find ways of making our lives and the people who use our systems better, right? I mean, we really have this kind of altruistic goal, and I do it in a rather selfish reason, because if I am not happy working on a code or a design, then how can I create something that's of value to someone else? So it's there's a feedback going on there. So, and I think a lot of it the idea of experimentation that I want to have us have a conversation about is, I may not know exactly what to do next, but if I have an open mind to possibilities, instead of just locked into the way I'm doing things, it can be really amazing. So that's my introduction to the topic.
I love it. I love that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It actually bubbled up so many ideas as you were saying those things. So it is a rich topic to address for sure. I mean, one of the things that made me think of is listening to Linda Rising talk about the book Fast and Slow Thinking. Mm-hmm. And for me, a lot of the work that I'm doing with clients is trying, along those same lines of trying to help them get out of that box of thinking the same way all the time. And one of the interesting things that mob programming brings to that is listening to what other people are thinking also, and just kind of blending all of that and just kind of jiggling people out of their, whether that's a comfort zone or someplace they're stuck, just thinking creatively. And experimentation, where, you're not going to harm anything if you're just experimenting, if they have that idea, then it gives them a little more freedom to think more creatively and move their thinking.
Well, I like what you're saying about the thinking. And so if we're relating this to mob programming, the idea that we can think and talk and diagram all we want, but until we take action, we're not learning much about what we've decided or what we've been thinking. And with I would say the focus on getting an idea into something we can actually try and turning it into something in software, we're going to write some code and see if it does what we hoped it would do. This expands our thinking. It's not that we need to decide before we do it. And this is something I like about DDD, is the idea that we're going to iterate. We're going to continuously be iterating. We're going to learn something by the doing that helps us with the thinking, and vice versa. As soon as we think of something, if we're focusing on how would we try that? How do we experiment with that? That's a very powerful thing. So I like this. I like this.
I've spent the last, I don't know, 6 weeks, I guess, trying to figure out with Explore DDD, what do I like about, and I'll get to the point, but I have to tell this little backdrop so people understand what I'm talking about. When you've scheduled a conference for September and then you find out because of the lockdowns and everything like that, that it can't happen, then someone like me, I start like, okay, so maybe running it as a virtual event is an option, but then I attend about 15 or 20 virtual events and start to realize that the kinds of things I love most about conferences, like the hallway track, the spontaneous mingling, the kind of conversations we're having at this moment, they're not always the present in those online events, and sometimes they can feel soulless. And so out of that, after about a month of that, I was like, okay, what are all the platforms that are out there? What are people using? Did some research on that. And then a week ago, I was like, okay, I think I've learned everything I can in terms of research. Now I'm going to learn by building, right? So found an Angular template, downloaded it, and 2 days later had a mock-up of, okay, this is what I think a virtual conference platform could be like that supports open space and started showing it around this week. And I just think that that's the way that I think about this kind of thing, is I have to learn by making. I have to have something that I can then start turning the dials on, and whether it's something visual like a mock-up or a prototype, or it's some kind of sketch or model, some kind of event storm or something like that. It has to be something tangible that I can then get feedback on. And I know that what I have right now is nowhere near what it would need to be, but I'm trying to push away the fog, right? That's what experiments are, is you're in this dense fog and you're trying to figure out, what is that next step? What's the next stone that I have to get to? And so all this feels very real for me as we think about this. I think Julie was emphasizing like experiments in process and also in design. And for me, it's very much in the realm of product and tooling at the moment, in terms of, what would it take to build a product that would actually do what we need it to do. So it's all very real.
It's interesting to me, because I think most people would stop at attending the different virtual conferences and experimenting with the existing tools and the existing software, as opposed to just kind of opening your mind up at that next level by saying, what if I wrote it myself, and not listening to that inner voice of, that's silly, there's so many already out there, right? Because you're learning so much from that.
It's right. And how much of that is the not invented here syndrome of, like every guitarist that says, yeah, I could play what he's playing or she's playing, but better, right? But,
Well, that's why there's oh, go ahead, please, Rebecca.
Anyway, so that's kind of interesting. I'd say that I'm not a tool hacker. I never have been, because I want to get the results done. So I'm accepting the limitations of my current tool chain, whatever that may be, in order to get to make content. But I like to experiment with content, like, CRC cards are great. So maybe I can use cards to capture heuristics. So I'm experimenting in other ways, I think we have our level of, where we want to experiment or not. And that's okay. If I'm delivering software and I'm in a company where I'm feature driven and we have to get things out and we're measuring our velocity and all that stuff, I'm just getting tired just saying this, right? It doesn't leave a lot of time for experiments unless you have an experiment card on the backlog or your Friday, your once a month hackathon on the weekends or something like that.
Well, so let's talk about that sustainability for a little while. Many, I don't know now, in the late 70s, I worked for a short while, or actually interacted for a short while with a guy I still greatly respect for the things he taught me way back then and how he's lived his life according to these things. But one of the things he shared with me when I was, younger, learning to do business, and I had a couple little businesses of my own, he said, I never do business with somebody that doesn't uplift me. That doesn't, when I'm done talking with them and they leave and I'm working on their work, that I don't feel good doing it. He says, don't work with people who push you down, work with people who lift you up. So what, if we extrapolate that or whatever, move it into what we're talking about right now, our work itself should be uplifting us. And the way we approach it should be uplifting us. And so we're always looking for, they say programmers are lazy. That's the best programmers because they're always looking for the easiest way to do something. But in a way, that's really an important thing, is let's find out what uplifts us. Let's focus on that. If we gave everybody a chance to do that, how much better would things be? I think it would be greatly better. That's my own philosophy.
I think you hit the nail there. If we're giving people that, right? I feel, but maybe you can relate more on that. Giving that to people, and I think most people who are software developers in team don't get that. Even worse, when they experiment, they will get blamed. They're cranking out features, as John Cutler writes in his 12 signs you're in a feature factory.
Oh, that's a good way to think of it. Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to hear what the rest of you have to say about that. Or not. Yeah.
Well, so it's interesting because I'm not sure that I absolutely need to tell if I'm in I'm going to be a counterculture revolutionary person here, but if I'm in a culture where we're measuring every last thing I'm doing, I don't necessarily have to give up some freedom to experiment. If I, but you're not supposed to be budgeted at 100% utility, even in, environments like that. So if I can find a way to do something, and so I'm not a tool hacker like Paul might be, but if I can find a way that if I'm doing something a couple of times over again, and I could build a little tool or a little frameworky thing that makes it easier, and then boom, then it comes out, and wow, what took me half a day might take me 10 minutes. So,
and that's because you're lazy.
No,
which is like just a joke, right?
I get bored. With doing the same thing over
and over again. Yeah.
It's
but we say it's lazy, right? Like something takes us a long time.
Or it's error prone, or it could be error prone because it's like this hand.
Right. You could make mistakes repeating.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I can't help thinking about, however, when we have this conversation about, if you're not happy in your work, or you're not uplifted, is there's always the people who don't have the option of leaving, which, that always is hard to comprehend, because I think we have so much freedom in the way we work and in our lives. So it would be great to be able to offer advice to people who are in a situation, where they're kind of stuck at work and they don't really have an option of just going to find another job, and they don't have the option of going home at night and doing those experiments because they've got family, they've got kids, they've got other responsibilities. I wonder if there's a way for people to find a way to enable that in their work. I know that the clients I've worked with, for the most part, the fact that they're bringing in a coach or bringing in somebody to do training already kind of shows something about that company, right? People taking time off. But yeah, there's always that flip side of it, of, people stuck and not having those opportunities. And just wondering if there's some way to weave that into those kinds of scenarios.
I think there's lots of ways to do it. And I think that that's part of what we need to focus on, for both for ourselves and those around us. When I'm coaching, and that's what I get, been blessed to be able to do for the last 4 or 5 years. When I go into a company, one of the things I'm asking people to do is, when you come in the morning, your first thought should be, how can I make it easier for the people around me to get their work done? How can I make it easier for them to have a good day? So if we ourselves get that attitude, we will attract others who are ready to have that attitude as well. And over time, and here we are sitting, we've never really worked for a long time together, any of us. But people who have worked with me, for several years or whatever, all my past work that I've done, they'll tell you I'm a hard to get along with. I get frustrated easily. I'm too picky about stuff and all kinds of stuff. And I've really worked on that over the last 15 or 20 years, when I realized how much of a jerk I was. I had to start trying to change that. And so I think we can do that for ourselves. Esther Derby, who's one of the coaches in this realm, often addresses this thing that, we don't necessarily have the power to make things get better, but we can influence it to get better. We can't say, hey, we're going to change, but we can influence the change. And essentially, everything's changing around us all the time. So we can put our influence into that change and make those changes too. We may never be able to make it perfect in our workplace, but we can make it better. And one of the secrets, I think, for me has been looking for the ones who are ready and communicating more and more with them. I was at a place for 6.5 years. That's the longest I think I've worked for somebody else ever. And that's what I started doing, just looking for others who are willing to work together to make things better. So to quote Esther Derby, she says something to the effect of, you don't need to let your people, work autonomously or, self-organizing. They're already doing it. You just don't realize they're already doing it. They've learned how to work within your, structure that is not a good structure. And it may not be benefiting you, but they've figured out how to deal with that structure. And so, yeah, it's better to understand people already do that naturally. I hope that was clear enough. Like, we are already doing this. Let's make it even better and better and better.
I wonder if that can be part of the experimentation we're talking about, like experimenting with the, social aspect. I know that's something that Kenny's involved in a lot, socio-technical aspect of teams. Maybe the experimentation goes beyond that, finding some freedom in experimenting with your design, experimenting with your code, to also experiment with the team and how things work on the team.
So making that sustainable means we can't have it draining us or pulling us down. We need to figure out how to do this. This is about little tiny habits and ways we interact. It takes time to build that and to change that.
Right. I think just to piggyback off that, it's the notion of marginal gains, right? Is always tiny incremental gains that build on each other over time. And no one particular small gain is going to seem all that impactful, but over time they add up. So if a team can take one manual task and automate it, that in itself may not be a big deal. But if they keep doing that over time, then they start freeing up capacity to spend more time on experiments. If they start doing something like a lunch and learn where they're learning something new every week, and that'll start influencing what they're doing and giving them a chance to experiment about that. Sorry, Kenny, I think I interrupted you.
So I think one of the interesting things about listening to all of this, to have this kind of attitude that Woody's talking about, or let's do this one thing, you can't be running as fast as you can at the time, because I cannot experiment when I'm running downhill and the bear is chasing me. So if I'm really in that situation, right? But is really our work life that way all the time? I hope not. Maybe it is, but I think one of the things that I have always found useful to experiment is to just give myself the permission to spend 10 minutes and then just throw whatever I did away. You know, it's
I love that. Yep.
Yeah, well,
that's great.
maybe in the mob you're supposed to check it in, but this is just my personal little thing, right?
No, there's
supposed to.
Don't get the wrong idea about mob
No,
programming.
no,
I don't have any rules. The
No,
rules of mob programming are there are no rules. Let's learn how to collaborate well. And whatever anybody wants to try, this is what I call taking the, well, each of us has the agency to suggest things, and the rest of us should allow those suggestions to be tried. But that doesn't mean that we need to keep anything that we try. You know, it's like when my daughter was a little girl, she was maybe 2 years old. We were at a Chinese restaurant, and here's this big bowl of soup, sizzling rice soup that's got all kinds of strange looking stuff in it. She says, I'm not going to eat any of that. And my wife said, well, look, this thing's really good. Just taste this with your tongue. And she tastes and she goes, okay, that's the only thing I'm going to eat. By the end of the meal, she was eating it all because it was all good. But we're afraid to try things that look a little bit strange. We try them, we can reject them as long as we know we can reject them. You know, how many times have you worked at a place where somebody comes to you after a big meeting and they say, oh yeah, we're going to go along with this for a little while, but in a few months, they're going to forget about it. You know, they know that if I ride this out pretty soon, we don't need to worry about it. And so this is, we learn to self-organize around it. I would really like to. Go ahead, Kenny. Yes.
Yeah, no, I think if I connected a bit where you started with people having cognitive dissonance, where you have the confirmation bias, and these small iterative things is what's usually lacking because people get big budgets, so they need to deliver, so they get these great big concepts in their mind, and then you get sunk cost fallacy.
Yes.
And these don't work. The longer you wait to tell your failure, the more you won't probably tell your failure. And I'm not sure which book this was, but there was a book that was calling about the war for that England and America did for mass destruction things. And they say, I think it was Bush and the guy from the UK, and they say, well, they have weapons of mass destruction. I think it was Iran or Iraq, but they never were. But if you ask them now, was it worth it? They will say, yeah. Well, the initial setup was, we're going there because they have weapons of mass destruction. So 5 years later, they can never say, no, it wasn't good. No, it's good, right? So the longer you tie yourself to that concept, the harder it is to.
Well, we have no way of knowing what they believed. We just know what they said, right? So, but I think Kahneman
yeah, of course, but it's a big concept in their brain.
Yes. There's a saying, we mentioned Kahneman a little bit ago, that he's got this thing he calls theory-induced blindness. And I think that, you know, we're all guilty of these things. The idea of theory-induced blindness is that once you've accepted a theory, it's extraordinarily hard to notice that it has flaws. So, you know, all things aside, we can notice that in ourselves. That's the purpose of these things. We're going to reflect. Let's take time to reflect and say, hey, do I have that? How does that happen? You brought up confirmation bias. Essentially, we couldn't exist if we didn't have confirmation bias, because we'd be taking so long to make any decision we need to make. We'd use up all our energy just making decisions, and our brains use up a lot of energy. Something like 25% of the energy of our body gets wasted in our brain. And so I'm really—
It's not wasted.
Yeah, I was just kind of kidding about that. But,
so there's a question. Sorry.
Oh, please, sure.
Yeah, there's a question. I think it came from your thing, Woody. There's a question by Jeroen Thibaut. He says, if you communicate more and more with those that want, what do you do with those that don't? Drop them? Question mark.
I've rarely had the opportunity in working in a place that I could get rid of people, you know, so it's like you work with the people that are there, and there's actually a lot of ways to allow all of us to coexist, those who will get along and not. But I think I would put it this way for myself. If you get something that's working well, then pretty soon others are attracted to it. I've noticed this with originally with things like working with pair programming, and then we've got a really effective sessions over a few weeks' time, and then somebody else says, "Why are you always sitting together?" They're drawn to the idea of it's a little different, and they're saying, "Oh, how can that work?" And say, "Well, it's been working good for us," and this just draws people. But you can't draw everybody. Not everybody's going to get along with these things. So I don't have advice about how do you deal with the people who will never get on board, except for that there's room for everybody. You know, am I right? It would be really presumptuous of me to say, oh, my idea is the right idea. This is how we should work. You know, that would be just as stupid as anything else. I just got to say, hey, this seems to be working for us, and it seems to attract people.
So it's interesting when you say that, you know, how do you deal with, you know, I guess people that are against what you're doing. I've been, you know, when I was an engineer at Tektronix, being successful sometimes gets people resentful, right?
Yeah.
And so it depends on kind of the power dynamics. If they have power over me, I might have to, you know, give away some of my quote unquote success to them just to keep doing what I'm doing. I mean, that sounds very politic, but I'm very serious about that. Oh, yes. But if someone is just like, I'm a threat to them, and I've worked with people who've, you know, if we're doing stuff fast and delivering things, we're a threat to other groups that aren't working so fast, then that can be very, very difficult kind of situation. So it's like, I don't want to anger or get other people upset, but I have to figure out, can I have this working relationship with people? Will they empower, you know, will they leave me enough alone in the group that I'm working with to do good things? And sometimes it's really a matter of this political stuff, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, you know.
Yeah,
so
that's wise. That's wise. So maybe a way to think about this is that there's this famous saying, I don't know who really originally said it, but it's amazing how much you can accomplish when you don't care who gets the credit.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting.
When you don't care who gets what?
Who gets the credit?
Oh, yeah.
So this is, and that's something I've worked with for a long time. I can reverse this. I owned a little business years ago in the 70s and 80s, where if somebody came in the front door and we didn't have their work done for them, you know, they were there to pick up something that we promised by that date, I can't turn to them and say, hey, it was Jimmy in the back room, he screwed up. You know, I got to take the blame for it. So I made sure we're never late. But this is sort of the reverse of it. Are we willing to take responsibility for accomplishing the things we really are interested in accomplishing? And that means we really need to realize we have the agency to do this. It may take us several years to learn how to do it. Fly under the radar, build a consensus with some people who are willing to do the things you think we should do, stay experimental, try to make some adapters around you that allow the people who won't ever get this.
That's one good use for some managers, is that they are good adapters for the rest of the organization. Seriously.
You know, there's lots of ways to do it. We need to learn what they are. And I think somebody earlier, maybe before we started this broadcasting part of this, mentioned Linda Rising. She's been in that space for a long, long time. She's written books about this. Fearless change. How do you make things get better when we should have put her on this panel? You know, when you don't have the power to make that happen. So you can make it happen. You do have the power. You just have to do it differently.
Yeah, well, so one of the things that I did as a manager to allow for experiments in my group when I was managing at Tektronix was I kind of I didn't schedule anything for us to be committed as a development team before 10 in the morning, and people would drop their kids off at work and have a couple of hours to work on what they needed to do to make life better before they got into this thick of all that stuff. So it was almost like, and we did that for a period of time just because I said, no, we're not scheduling meetings before 10. My group can't handle that right now. And so that relieved, that allowed them to figure out what they're doing. And it was a high stress kind of product development effort. And so if you are in a position of power where you can give people room to experiment, that's really nice. It may not solve everything because they may have other stresses on what they're doing, but figuring out very complex software and systems when it's pressure is like, that's a bad combination right there. Yeah.
I had a really interesting conversation with a guy, I think he was a CTO of his company. This was a bunch of years ago. This was more about giving people time to learn and explore, so different kind of experimenting. And what he was telling me was that he found the younger people on the team did not like doing that because they didn't want to get into a place where they might fail at something by learning something new. They wanted to keep doing what they were good at and what they were successful at. And they were afraid of failing and therefore unwilling to explore and experiment. He was giving them a full day out of the work week to just go learn something new.
Oh, wow, I'd like to go work there.
Yeah. So, well, doesn't like Google do that or something? So I think
it's a myth.
This was a long time ago. I think today, if I encountered somebody with that same problem, I would recommend something more like mob programming, right? Well, bring everybody together and let them experiment, pick something to play with, and they do it together and
for a couple of hours or something.
Yeah.
I have a small insight and question.
I just remember going, what? And he said it was really the youngest people on the team, like, kind of fresh out of college, couple of years, junior developers.
Wow.
So I have a question here for you that popped into my mind. Did Scrum and Agile actually make experimentation less there? Because in Waterfall, people would have 6 months of a deadline or 1 year. Now they have 2-week deadlines. So maybe that puts more pressure on them and saying, well, you need to crank out these user stories in Jira, and you said it was 2 points. It's just a role that got into my mind where I was at a certain point, where I am now in a team, where they say, well, if we're going to do this online collaboration, do you have an epic for me somewhere in Jira so that I can put things on? So that was going in my mind now. So I did actually the shorter iteration without losing the deadline that's behind it actually make it worse for especially new people, so that they come in, what, I need to deliver every 2 weeks? What do you think?
I want to defend Agile and just say, don't use Scrum and Agile in the same sentence, please. So, okay. But
sure.
Agile is merely about, let's figure out how to work well together. Let's make sure we're including all the voices. Let's make sure we're experimenting a lot. Both of those things have the idea of that in it, but Agile is really not about forcing short deadlines. It's about delivering something frequently. That's a very different.
So
I agree with you, Woody, but that's how it's, where I go is it's being perceived.
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I tend to think that that's people's percepts of what Agile and Scrum, that I have to deliver faster. It will make me go faster, so I have to go faster. I remember back in the early days at the first Agile Development Conference back in Utah, right, where people were talking about that they didn't use the Scrum terminology when they took back those practices to their company, because sprints, we can't sprint and the original Scrum, I'm going to make this comment, had variable length sprints that you could change from sprint to sprint what the duration was. So if you wanted to sprint for 2 days, but nobody, that's like too loosey-goosey. So people like the simple, straightforward answer. And I'm going to make another comment or observation is the original XP, extreme programming, which, had a lot of roots of what the Agile folks, is that they had the notion of what's called a design spike, right? But what that meant for a design spike, if you go back to the XP programming website, it was not on the schedule. I didn't know how to do something. So I would declare that I'm going to not spike a solution, but spike an experiment. And then I'll come back and then know what I need to do next. So it wasn't that you were supposed to spike a solution, that everybody now wants to spike a solution. They were just experimenting, and I might just throw it away. So those things were back there in the origins. I think it's just people have been entrenched them into this sort of rigid, let's go faster, and we'll be better if we go faster. As an old marathoner, because I don't run marathons anymore, but having run marathons, you don't sprint. You have different paces and cadences. So
I like that. So I've often, for a long time, I've thought about this as, and somebody in a workshop that I was giving just a few months ago said, what you're trying to do is shorten the race. So I like that. We're not running faster. We're shortening the race. In other words, to get from where we want to start, to where we want to end, we're gonna cut across the field instead of running all the way around the track. And kind of this is what mob programming is to me. It's a very much sort of what some people would call a Kanban idea, is that let's focus on a single thing with all the brains we've got. We're going to get through this thing directly from start to finish without the context switching, the cognitive load that we normally carry because we're sharing it with everyone else. We're not being disrupted. We're not multitasking. We're able to work in a way that's very naturally productive without being stressful, without taking up much of our energy. We're sharing the load. If in this case, if we're doing something that Julie's an expert on, I don't have to have that in my brain. Julie's going to share that part of it. But when it comes to the thing I'm expert on, that's where I'll contribute. She doesn't have to have that in her brain. So we're no longer having to keep all the details about how's this going to affect that and how's that going to break that. And is this what our product owner meant? Well, they're part of the team. They should be there. Matter of fact, almost everywhere I've been, the biggest bottleneck is the people writing software communicating with the person who is supposedly knows what it's supposed to do. And that bottleneck can really slow us down. When we eliminate that and get rid of that queuing, and we get rid of the context switching and the cognitive shifts and all that, we've shortened the race. We're no longer having to go this long race where we're still going at a slow pace, but we've made a shorter
sustainable. So one observation about that, Woody, and then I'd like some other folks here to chime in on that. That works great if you have a small cohesive team. If you're creating a large product, and I'm thinking, Microsoft Word or whatever, there are independencies. It's bigger than just a team flow. I might be working on a feature, but it's independent on other things. So it seems like it's easier to do this experimentation when you're small.
But I want to interject something there, and then I'd like to hear from the other voices as well. We have that same disconnect when we're all working solo. Right?
Sure.
So what we've done is we've gotten rid of as much of it as we easily can. Can we get rid of more of it? Sure, by decoupling. That's a big part of what DDD is about, is the idea we're going to decouple these things so this doesn't care about that and so on. but I hope
But there are dependencies. There are
the
dependencies.
dependencies will always exist, but we've reduced a great number of them. Because I no longer have a dependency on everyone else around me. I now have a dependency on what some other groups are doing. But we've gotten rid of a good number of the dependencies. But let's go ahead. Let's see what others might want to talk about.
Well, I just like to build on that slightly. Is the way that I tend to think about this. My mental model, I guess, is a sort of a flow of value through the team. And so, Woody, when you're describing like not having access to the person that knows or has the best idea what the team should actually build, then that's a stoppage, that's a blockage at the front of that flow, right? Yeah. And when I read a book like Accelerate that talks about the power of DevOps and automation, that's addressing, in my mind, all the blockages at the back end of the flow. Is like you want that smooth flow of value. Anything we can do to eliminate accidental complexity or infrastructure as part of that is about removing blockages in that pipe of flow out of the team so that you can get stuff in production fast and get to value fast. And then if you can do both of those, then it comes down to, like Rebecca said, the connections between teams and using different decoupling patterns between teams so that you have good boundaries and can have cohesion of language and model and implementation, and like each team has their own sandbox where they can experiment and do that quickly. And so it's this fuzzy front end of experimentation and design that I think we're really trying to make sustainable. And a lot of that is by just getting closer to single piece flow, like you're describing with mob programming, or at the very least getting teams to limit the amount of work in progress, limit the things they say yes to, so they can actually focus and build in slack and time for experimentations along the way. So I very much agree with what you're saying with that, and at least that's the mental model that I have when I'm thinking about this.
So can we really do this on legacy systems that may have all the tangles in there? That, I mean, it is so easy to have this design and experimentations on systems that are new and evolving fast.
Right.
Legacy systems. Oh.
Right.
Go ahead.
I think adopting, like Eric talks about, doing DDD, succeeding with DDD around legacy systems. And so the idea of what he calls a bubble context or a strangler application, building something alongside that legacy application that isn't shackled
a little
to
something alongside.
A little something that is high, potentially high value, that is connected to some kind of differentiator for the product that the business really cares about, but something that is modest enough in size that the team can actually get it done in a short period of time, and build a capability in a short period of time that, to go back to what Woody said earlier, that can establish credibility and a sense of momentum behind the work that other people can then build on and embrace. That's what I've seen work. Sorry, Woody, you were going to say something.
No, I was just kind of, I think I'm in agreement there for sure. And I like everything about this. We need to be exploring these ideas. I think that legacy code is where we all live. Most people talk about greenfield or legacy, but greenfield stops being greenfield the minute we have something working that we want to have continue working. Now we have what I would call legacy code. Legacy code doesn't have to be hard to work on. Legacy code is just something that exists that we want to keep it. We inherited it from ourselves yesterday. If it's something we wrote ourselves, it's something we inherited from a previous team or whatever, but it's what we have and we want to keep it. To me, that makes it our legacy.
Maybe there's no greenfield or brown. Maybe everything is Puce, like every project.
Yeah, there you go.
Like
that's sort of true. We move past, so what we have to do is change our way of thinking when we're working in the perception of what we're working on in these two different areas. I haven't yet seen an application that we couldn't improve in a generally easy to approach way if we're willing to do that. But boy, I worked at a place once where we had a couple million lines of code, and there were some modules there that would get bugs in it. And whoever decided to work on that code would have the honor and respect and pity of everyone else in the
Right.
programming group. Every morning we looked at the things that came forward, and somebody would say, okay, I'll tackle that, you know. And it was kind of like, we know they might not come out alive from working on that stuff. But the key to it is to start decoupling every time you touch that code. And eventually you can end up with something that is much more pleasant to work on if we're willing to make those efforts.
Well, so that kind of argues for building things like adapters so that you have, you know, not this funky interface to something, but you have a common way of talking to things. It's building the, I don't say plumbing and fixtures to isolate, and there's some like anti-corruption patterns that you can do in the domain-driven design space, that you don't just do the, I won't say the most straightforward way. Sometimes you have to build the scaffolding to allow you to have a nice environment. And so that's something that, since I came from, you know, like first learned about design patterns, you know, back in the ancient days, it's like, to me, if I saw that I needed to do that, I would just kind of suggest that we do that. But some people might think of that as being extra work.
Oh yeah. And who are those some people anyways?
Fellow developers.
Yeah.
And you can also bring that back to the ideas of experimentation, because building those, whether you're doing strangler pattern or whatever, that you can experiment to try to find, maybe you think you know what's going to give you the biggest bang for the buck, but you know, those might be some of the experiments that you would do with, you know, how to adapt your legacy application.
I mean, so the easiest thing is just to use some awful API that someone wrote 30 years ago, right? But it's hard, right? If I can cut away that crap, there's a reason for a facade pattern. There's a reason for adapters, you know, make it simpler for my code to work.
So I also think back of when I started, and I started on a big legacy that was 10 years old. And I learned some TDD somewhere, but I tried to work on this TDD, on this code with it. And I'm like, nah, it doesn't have unit tests at all. I won't do it. And then this guy who has, I think, 30 years experience sat next to me, say, why aren't you doing this? And he had a conversation. He showed me how to do it. And I think that's what usually lacking here, is that the first part is always hard. I wanted to give up there, by the way. I'm being honest. I just didn't want to do it. But this guy took me in, say, we're going to do it. And afterwards I learned. And now I'm happy he did it, because now I actually am, what you say, Woody, more happy to do that. And but that comes to a question from YouTube, from Joost van de Bovenkamp. He says, how much experimentation is too much experimentation? Can this happen?
Well, when you hit 110% experimentation, you've overdone it. Yeah. So
when is enough?
I want to throw something in here that I share all the time. The paper by Sturman and Repenning from MIT called "Nobody Ever Gets Credit for Solving Problems That Never Happened." And this basically, his basic argument is that, or their basic argument is that we should be spending the lion's share of our time in increasing capability, learning to do this stuff better, and less time in actually doing the work we're supposed to be getting done. And my goal would be, that's going to be 80 or 90% of our time, because we're getting rid of all the stuff we do. When we focus on the work, we're losing capability. When we focus on making it easier to do the work, we are gaining capability. And we want to keep gaining capability. As soon as we stop doing that, the work's going to get harder and harder, and we're going to eventually end up with an organization that can't experiment. They're always putting out fires, as they say. This is like, literally with a fire department. I worked with a fire department for 6 or 7 years as a board of directors member. We spend most of our time training and preparing for doing the work that we occasionally need to do, of serving at a traffic accident or putting out a fire.
Right.
This is a good way to approach things, in my opinion.
And it's like the intelligence version of technical debt.
Yes.
So Paul, you wanted to say something.
Well, I was just going to build on what Woody said, that, fire departments and that have to make sure that buildings adhere to fire codes, and there's nothing sexy about that, right? But that's the thing that stops fires much more than actual fire departments going out and actually putting out fires. And something just popped into my head. My very first job out of college, I was working for a company called MapTech back in Perth, Australia, where I was from, and C, Fortran, existing code base, and the way that everything, the way that you built a version of the application you could run was through static linking on a Unix box. And that process typically took about 2 hours. So when you made a change, it took about 2 hours to link that change statically with the rest of the code base and look at that. And I remember thinking that's a long time to get feedback on something. And so I started looking around at other options. I guess I'm just a researcher. I can't help myself, but I started reading up on things, and I came across this thing called dynamic linking. And I was like, I wonder if that could work. So I ran some experiments where you had to kind of pre-compile all these link libraries, and then you could dynamically link them. And then the first time I ran it on our build, the build took 2 minutes.
So
and from
Paul,
then on,
I have to tell you a story. I have to interrupt. I have to tell you a story. My very first product development is I designed a universal dynamic linking loader at Tektronix and implemented it by myself.
Oh my goodness.
And so you could type in, resolve addresses that you didn't have because it had a command line thing, and then you could lay out the memory how you wanted to, and then boom, it would just do it. So the thing is, building or using the right tool helps. I'm not a tool maker. But finding the right tools really helps you have the time for experiments. And I'm going to bring this up because I am amazed by the number of people that I work with on a day-to-day basis that use Vim and don't have refactoring tools in their IDE because they're using, a text editor.
A real text editor, yeah.
They're just text editing. And for me, one of the joys is be able to push a button and say, I want to do this refactoring, moving something out, whatever. And so it behooves us to have tools that enable us to do these kind of things, because I would not try to do renaming and refactoring or the kinds of extraction or all those refactoring patterns by myself, by hand.
Right. Well, and I think, that's what I'm getting at, is experimenting with tools, right? Is to say, is there a better way of doing this? Is there a tool that can make this easier? And the upshot of that was, it seemed like a waste of time, me experimenting with dynamic link libraries, but within a couple of weeks, everyone in the office had 2-minute builds. And it completely changed the workflow for how we develop the product, because when you can make a change, go and grab a cup of coffee and come back and see the result of that change or demo it to a client, that's a totally different dynamic. And I think a lot of teams are still stuck in that kind of mindset of we make a change and then there's this long cycle feedback loop, this long lead time before you actually get feedback on that. And so spending time experimenting with how to improve that can free up capacity on the front end for being able to build the things you really need to build, and experiment in other areas, like what model you need to have and how to interact better with other teams and so on.
Maybe we need to all add in experiment spikes to our workflows. Yeah. Like that's a normal part of it.
It just is. Yeah, don't call it a design spike because people pound it down.
Right.
So Dave Snowden with his Kinevin says probes running. A probe is sort of like an experiment, right?
In the complex space.
In the complex space.
So this is right. Our experiments are probably not in the complex space where we can't predict cause and effect. So I think they're slightly different. Yeah.
So, but he allocates fixed time and budget, and that's not what you want to do in this space.
No, I just want to hide it from the other activity and let it happen and flow when we need to do it.
Yeah.
Now, I think there are other kinds of experiments. Maybe we need innovation spikes or probes on. I mean, maybe there's different kinds of experiments.
Yeah. So Aman on YouTube says, would addressing tech debt be a part of that experimentation? Even though it doesn't provide features, it potentially makes it easier to do so.
For sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Experimenting over how to deal with the technical debt, I would see as a critical aspect of speeding up the flow through the team, because technical debt ultimately manifests itself in most cases as a slowdown of flow. It slows down your ability to deliver. So if you can address that, I just put it in the same category.
So it's I just finished shepherding Casper's experience report about his DDD experience for the Agile Alliance. And you talk about technical debt usually as poorly structured code, but he told a story in there of they'd changed the meaning from one word to another in this reward system. And a new developer came along and they said, oh, fix the whatever. And they didn't have the, it was points versus, whatever. It was a different concept. And he goes to the code and he can't find the concept that they're talking about. And the guy was like, oh, I just need to name these methods and these classes and these to have that concept in there. And he did that when he added, a feature fix. So the debt could be even badly named things that don't match the concepts. I mean, that's a debt too. That is a technical debt, language debt. And that's why if I'm using a tool, I want to rename, if I can rename things, I like my refactoring tools.
It's already a good experimentation, I find, in design. So I've been running this same for my workshops for a year, and all of a sudden is, let's call it not reservation, but allocation, see what happens. And I came into a total different model. I'm like, why didn't I do this earlier?
Yeah, I've been studying, currently I'm studying these ancient Indo-European roots of language that much of the world uses, and how words get used and change over eons of time. And it's quite interesting. A big part of how we think is wrapped up into how we're able to express an idea that we have. So in reading that book, and I'm not a scientist of any sort, it's just clipping off in my head how relevant this is to domain-driven development and or design, and how what words we use, and how willing are we to find those, the context for those words. Are we willing to do this? And if we are,
or experiment with the words.
Let's experiment with the words. But when we find a word that works well for describing something, I'm going to give a quick example. I know we're running out of time, but we were in the middle of working on something when we first started mob programming. And one thing that I noticed was that now we are seeing patterns we would never have seen before, because everybody is working on everything. So we're no longer isolated. Like, I'm working on something, you're working on something. We never get to see that there was a pattern between those things. So as we did it, we came up with this thing and we noticed how it was working. We made it pretty straightforward and simple, the best that 5 or 6 people seeing there it could do. And then we set it aside and went to the next thing and the next thing. Well, 2 or 3 things later, a week later or whatever, we realized, hey, this is similar to that other thing we did. So we brought out the other thing we did, refactored it to move out the variable part that we just discovered. And then we just needed to write the variable part for this new version of the same problem. And off we went. A few weeks later, we found another instance of that. And we started giving it the right name. We started calling it a transaction. This was a transaction. Now we had a pattern of our own that was only meaningful in our code in this project of the transactions that were happening. And it ended up, there were about 50 of them within this application. But this is what happens when we're all observing together. We get to come up with the terminology that makes sense for the project we're doing. And if we can tie that into, and as we would do in DDD, into the domain itself, that's how we want to think about it. Not how we think as programmers, how we think as the business people who are guiding this creation of this software. It really worked very well, but it changes over time. Arlo Belshi, I'm sure some of you know him, talks a great deal about this. Naming is a process. It's not like an event that just occurs. It's not just something you do. They reveal themselves. You won't get good names up front. They'll change as you go.
I remember one of the first things that Eric, when I first met Eric, that stuck with me was he talked about in DDD the importance of the phrase he used, is, if I remember it correctly, was a lively experimentation with language as being key to developing a good ubiquitous language, right? And so much of what we teach in the DDD immersion classes is trying to encourage a lively experimentation with language. I've struggled with this, like just over the last week, thinking about how would you, in a virtual event, how do you enable a hallway track? And do you even call it a hallway track, or is it something else? Because hallway implies a physical space. Is it just a way for people to mingle, which is more to do with the conversation? And then you're in some kind of virtual space. So is it a room, or is it a session, or like trying to sort of get my head around some of these concepts and how would you express them in a way that resonates with people?
Yeah, so at the XP conference, we do have a hallway track that's coming up. And we have a liberating structures kind of activity there at the beginning, and then people can go hang out at the hallway and chat. But you have to talk about these concepts about what you want. I mean, it took us a while to do that, but the terminology again, and then the tools you have. There always is this mismatch between the technology and our language. And that's something I think it's worth the effort to try to not just let the tooling dictate our language. It's going to push it one way or the other.
This whole conference today is one big experiment, to be honest.
Yes.
Yeah, we wanted.
Bravo.
Yeah, we wanted to do it that way. We actually had more ideas that didn't make it, or we didn't.
So did you have breakout rooms or?
Yeah, we had on the hands-on tracks. We did have breakout rooms, and all the hands-ons was really experimental. I loved the last one from Jenny, who was just, okay, what are we going to do? And she was doing a mob fire drill, but eventually got into event storming. And I was just seeing that for 2.5 hours, and it was really fun. And but the thing about the hallway, we had the same idea. How can we emulate that? And it reminded me way back in my gaming area where we would use something like Ventrilo. Now you have Discord, where you can just easily switch the rooms. And that's what I always tell to people. Zoom and Teams and everything, you need an invite. Well, if you're just in the Discord space, you can just switch rooms and you see, hey, I see this person in that room. Let's just join that conversation. But yeah, we didn't make it today, but still on my mind it's been one big experimentation, and I loved it, even though it costs a lot of time, but it's still
single really track though, or 2 tracks at most. So that's good. That's another thing about experiments. I think they have to be bounded. It's not open-ended.
Right. And it helps if they're fun too. keep it interesting. If the experiments are burdensome, then there has to be some energy that comes from that, or it's not sustainable, right? If something is a drudgery, then it's not going to.
It's time now to experiment. Let's go experiment.
Yeah, just groan.
Yeah, it kind of blows it.
Yeah.
Well, that's something I ask often when I'm doing mob programming sessions, teaching. I will ask people, when do your best ideas come to you? I just want them to share. Once somebody shares, then we get about 10 or 15 people will share. When do your best ideas come to you? And there's the 3 most frequent things I hear. The first one is in the shower. That's the most frequent. The next one has something to do with sleep. Like waking up, I'm in the middle of the night, or I'm just going to bed. And the last one is while walking or running, or things similar to that. Those are the 3 places. And I think these are all tied into ultimately our humanness. So this is something we kind of forget. I like to joke, has a boss ever come into your group and said, hey, look, we really need some good ideas right now. Go take a shower, Well, no boss thinks that way. They think you got to think harder, think faster, think better. When really we need to let it go and move to a different environment.
Yeah, I saw somebody in the side panel here. It goes, intoxication plays a big role for me. And I must say, I get very creative after my glass of wine.
Yeah, loosens up your thinking.
Yeah.
You know, back to
I'm
the
not,
slow and fast.
I'm not
thinking.
drunk. I'm just happier.
Right.
Well,
Well, the
I worked-
common theme there is downtime, right?
it's a downtime.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's built into us as humans. I think that, and I'm trying to study these things right now. I think that we spend most of the eons of time that humans have existed walking a lot more than we have, sleeping without the interruptions of all the things we have nowadays, and the nature around us, which gives us a kind of white noise that we don't get in the way we live right now. And I believe that walking, and I've seen this with a lot of people now, they will go out and purposefully just walk. And then when they're done with the walk, they're going, oh, I know what I want to try now. And if they don't do that, they won't get that idea. Now, it may not always happen. It may not come to you right then and there. You can't plan it. You can't force it. This is the idea from Graham Wallace, about the incubation period. You can't control the incubation period. Like the chick's going to hatch out of the shell in a few weeks, but you know exactly the moment we're not going to be able to predict. I kind of like that idea.
That's interesting what you say. I'm now reading a book about high sensitive, and there's not a lot of study there, and it goes in about everyone has their over arousal. So everyone has their different limit of when they're going, but everyone knows this. When you're going over arousal, you're just going shutdown.
Because too much is going on. Yeah.
Too much going on. So for everyone, that's different, and everyone works different. And that's the hard part, is you cannot, because that now you're getting into complexity and not in well, so, let's give you 2 hours for this. And maybe in that 2 hours that I get the time to experiment, I'm gone in my brain. I'm like, okay, I cannot experiment here.
So that's actually interesting, Kenny, because I remember shepherding an experience report by Aaron Griffin about life as an introvert in a mob. and he had to find his own space so he could go off and maybe do some personal coding for things, or, you know, just to not be totally in the mob all the time. And he also had to find a way to collaborate without feeling, you know, all the extroverts were speaking over him. So that really kind of says to your personal, you know, taking care and being aware of those sorts of rhythms that you have. Because I think if I'm working on something and I feel the pressure to innovate, oh my goodness, you know, the last thing you need is you need a little pressure. If you have no pressure, then stress is not a bad thing. It's too much stress is the bad thing.
I know for me, over the last 2 months, with everything that's been going on around the world, it's that the stress level has been so high, and trying to figure out what things energize me. And so experimentation is one of those. My best pair programming partner is my dog Tango, because she hears all my theories about things every day. And
walking around the lake
or just down the street. It's the whole thing of downtime and finding things that create the energy and the space to look at things from a different angle. And I think that's what experiments do, or being able to step back from something and feel that you have the space to do that, and then say, well, what if I did it this way? Like, that's so crazy, it might just work, and give it a shot. And whereas just being in it all the time, particularly as, you know, I'm very, to Rebecca's point, like I'm very extreme up on the introvert scale. And so being able to do the things that give me energy so that I can actually reach out to other people is a big part of that too. So the downtime and the ability to step back and to, like, those are the things that help me make work sustainable and just life sustainable in general. Spending time with people I care about, that care about me. These are all invaluable things.
I like that.
And that's the danger now, I guess. I find myself now in this situation. Is I'm working 32 hours for a company, for a customer, and it's easier now to go from one meeting to the other. It's just one push of the button. And yeah, it is. And normally I would just walk out the room and I need to take some stairs or something, take some elevators, and it will cost me 5-10 minutes. Now, one click of the button and I'm still sitting.
And you're back in the matrix.
Yeah, you're back in the matrix. And that's what people.
Yeah, I was speaking to someone who said they had 40 hours of Zoom and various online meetings that week. This is last week. Now. And I'm going, oh my goodness. So it doesn't have the Slack in it, does it? That's actually a kind of a problem.
So paying attention to that is important.
Right.
So that I've had 6 weeks of working directly with one group of folks, and we purposefully took 15 minutes out of every hour. We were mob programming, but 15 minutes of every hour, we just shut it down. You go off, do whatever you want. When you get back, we continue going. We were working together 8 hours a day, taking taking a full hour for lunch, but 8 hours a day of more or less being together. And it was pleasant. We quickly went from a team that never worked with mob programming or remotely to a team that was making what I would consider very good progress, massively good progress, without it becoming overbearing for us. Now, there are some people who naturally want to keep it going when it's done. And they're welcome to do that. If you've got a thought in your mind and you want to finish it out, that's the Zeigarnik effect thing, where once you get if you get an idea in your brain, you don't let it finish, it's going to clog your brain for a while. So you get to do that if you want to do that. But it's not required that everybody remain, well, let's make this clear. Mob programming isn't about everyone paying absolute attention to everything that's going on. Throughout the day, our attention is wavering. As soon as somebody says something that's interesting, we shut off the listening. We think for a few minutes, and then we go, oh, that guy's still talking? And then we listen to them again. And other things like that happen. And we might just be getting bored. I understand these things. It happens to me. And I can see it in people's eyes whenever I talk with them. Oh, they zoned out on what I was saying. I better shut up. And so, and I'm actually very much a recluse, and I would consider myself somewhat of an introvert. I've always avoided speaking in front of people and in a crowd and so on. I've had to learn and force myself to learn how to do these things. But we got to figure out for ourselves and recognize that we're all different. But I just want to emphasize that we need to pay attention to this. Let's experiment with how much should we be doing? What if we chop it up a little more? What if we spend a half hour working and a half hour not working?
So
go ahead.
That's actually an interesting set of experiments, because I was talking to my son the other day, and he's saying, well, and I was talking to a friend, and both working remotely, right? So one's a manager, my son's like on the phone a lot, right, and at his computer. And they were basically saying, oh, I find I can't just concentrate like I was when I was in the office, right? And I'm going, well, maybe in the office, we had all these little mental breaks. And now when we're just in front of our screens all day long, you know, are we really less productive? I think we're stressed. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I know I am. But were we really, hunkered down and 100% effective at work? I don't think so. I think our expectations when we're, I should be able to do the same things the same way. When you're sitting all the time, I know I can't stand. I need to stand up.
Yeah, I'm standing. That's why you see me wiggling around every once in a while.
Yeah. So it's interesting, because I think at a physical work, when you're collaborating with people, that you're actually getting those breaks, but you're not aware of them.
So there's my key heuristic remotely. Every 20 minutes, I just do a 1 or 2 minute break, minimal, and tell people to just walk around.
You tell them.
Yeah.
You're the coach.
Well, I cannot see them doing it, but
Well,
that's
you
up
didn't
to
tell
them.
us to.
No, I didn't
Yeah,
tell
what's
you
up with
this.
that,
So
Ken?
we need to,
Yeah, sorry.
go
You
walk
need to
around
get
the
For
those
lake.
online
anklet,
collaboration. So no,
Get-
I think about Sharon Bowman's 6 trumps.
Yeah,
I don't know if you know them. Training from the back of the room. I think you know, Paul, right?
yeah. Movement trumps sitting.
I go on my rowing machine or on my bike.
Well, you know, Aaron, I think in his paper probably talked about taking walks as well.
Yes.
You know, so that when I found for myself at a very young age that if I'm active, that it really keeps me energized. And when you're not active, you start, you know, just melting away. And so this is something I've tried to do throughout this time of me doing more, less physically active work, more brain level work. I try to take a lot of walks. If we take
We
a
need
walk,
to have a virtual walk. We need to have a virtual walk together.
let's do that as
Excuse
soon as we
me.
can.
I
I'm open
can-
to that.
Wait,
We'll
I
go
can do
see
it
you.
all. I can walk. I didn't want to make you all dizzy walking for an hour and a half.
Oh, that's
But I got
cool.
my treadmill right here. I got a
Oh, that's
treadmill.
Oh,
excellent.
yeah, man.
But that
yeah.
doesn't give me a mental break, right? That
No,
just
but
keeps me moving.
My guess is when you're using your legs, you're pumping a lot more blood through your body than when
And your
you're sitting.
brain.
And I
Yeah.
think your brain gets an advantage out of that. Maybe I'm wrong. I'd like to see the data on that. But I know that simply writing stuff down or drawing, from what I've studied, activates different parts of your brain. I believe walking is going to activate different parts of your brain. I've known a couple people who would merely doodle. They weren't taking notes. They were just drawing circles and little swirly things and whatever. And that would activate the brain. But we activate different parts of our brain by doing different things. So just simply sitting there is probably starting to limit. So if we add these other things in, and one thing I really love is getting up to the whiteboard with a team, someone like Scott Ambler used to talk about, or somebody, you know, was it him? He said, you know, the power of 2 developers at the whiteboard. I think part of it is we're now expressing using a different part of our brain. And when we include all of these things, we are going to get, I hope, let's experiment with it, but we're going to get some advantages we're not going to find if we just stick to the one thing. Not everybody can do these things. I know that, but yeah, why not? Let's give it a try.
Yeah.
So
I remember
experiment.
10 years ago, I was on a team we were distributed between here in Denver, Chicago, and Buenos Aires. And well, this would have been 2008. We bought smart boards for each location. And so we would stand there and draw on these smart boards and it would come up live in the other locations. I mean, how is it that a decade later, this is not standard stuff for teams, right? Especially remote teams. Is like, how have we come so
now it's in your browser or Miro and you're doing it on your keyboard.
Well, yeah,
on my iPad,
if you have access to these, most companies don't even have access to.
So let's address that. I've worked at places where I've got, let's say, me and 4 other developers are all going, hey, these computers are so slow, but we can't get anyone to allocate, you know, $5,000 in the day. You know, you could get a computer for $1,000. It was way better than whatever you had. You know, we couldn't get anybody to allocate for that. Now, when I was young, I was a sign painter at one time. In my box of brushes, I had brushes that cost me $200. You know, we talk about, oh, somebody say, I don't want to buy that tool. Gosh, it's $140 subscription every year I got to pay. Dang, a plumber who doesn't have a box full of really valuable tools is working a lot harder than they want to work. It goes for your auto mechanics. It goes for gardeners. It goes for all of us. And boy, if we can't get the funds to get the tools like smart whiteboards, if that's what good, let's at least experiment with it. This is the idea. This is really what it's about. We don't see the cost as being paid back, and we're not willing to even give it a try to see if it will happen. I think that making it easier for a developer to work will pay back untold amounts. Yeah. So and yet we never get that chance.
In that same company, I just went online, got Mural, and we are using it now. And the only thing I say, don't put any sensitive data in. That's all. Don't write sensitive data on the sticky, but let's try it. And the progress is enormous. I was just going there and experimenting, and I've done
Well,
4 in a row, and all 4. I've done the event flow thing, Paul. On
So is that Mural,
with 5 teams.
M-U-R-A-L?
M-I-R-O.
Yeah,
Mural.
because
Those are both good tools.
Yeah, Miro is
Right.
blocked, so I needed to use Mural, and I never used that. But it got easy within 2 hours. We had alignment on a value stream map, the way Paul describes in event storming for value stream mapping for event flow. And now we're taking 1 or 2 hours more to get in the queues. But you already see in this 2 or 4 hours of experimentation that the team is getting a whole different mindset and a whole different. First, when it came in, they were thinking, "Oh, why would I be transparent about what I do to you?" Right, first. But as we progress, as they were in it, at the end, they were really happy because they could express their frustration about the process, and that was wonderful. Just by an experimentation of 2 hours with a few teams.
I'm really excited about this. This is really a space we've got an opportunity right now to try all these things. A lot of it is, before we just didn't take, and it's just a great time for it. I want to share my thinking. It's just this, that the whiteboard in a traditional sense is our shared memory location for the team. We put things there so we all can have them. We don't need to keep them so much in our brain. We put them there to refer to at any moment we need it throughout the working day. At the end of the day, maybe it could all get thrown away or be carried over to tomorrow. But that shared memory location is super powerful because it keeps us from having to repeat things. Now, if I say something to you, then you didn't quite get it, and I have to say it again, then you start to get it a little bit. And then the next time it comes up, let's say 20 minutes later, we have to reiterate what we said. If we put it on the whiteboard, it captures it. And it starts becoming a reality to everybody. Well, I didn't understand this. Can you explain it again? So getting it on the whiteboard and then getting it into code, if it's code that we're working on, quickly gives us this really shared understanding that we don't get from just having the conversations.
So another thing that I actually think is useful, and I learned this trick from an architect I met at a client site, is that he kept his personal Kanban on stickies in his office, right? So you could see everything that he was working on because he's interacting with multiple teams. And so when someone would ask this guy, what's going on? What's your, he'd say, oh, okay, well, so you could see his work flowing because he's one of these people that wasn't on a team. And I tend to think that it wasn't like he was showing off. He was just showing all the different things he had to do. So you got an appreciation if he was thinking about this team over here and that product feature over there, and so sharing your personal Kanban of all the stuff that's going on in your life if you're working in a company is not a bad idea. It very much gets an appreciation. If you're just snapshotted into a meeting, they think, oh, well, nothing else is going on. What are you, But anyway, it was just, I was impressed by that. So I tend to think that's another way. Information radiators is what Alistair Coburn talks about. So,
yeah,
that's
a
personal
brilliant.
Kanban is a kind of personal radiator for all the concerns I happen to have at work right now.
I have a friend who works for the state, and she has to manage a lot of cases, and people have a really hard time comprehending how many cases she's juggling at once. So she actually came up, and because now everybody's distributed, she came up with this idea of, I don't know how she's doing, she might be just using an Excel spreadsheet or something, but a way of presenting all 130 cases and then the status of them. And then now she's having weekly meetings with the people who are in charge of what she should be doing, so that they have a gauge of where she's at and they all make decisions about what she should be focusing on instead of going, what's going on with all of it, right? So she's taking, she came up with that on her own, right? She's experimenting with how to help herself and how to communicate what she's working on and how to get everybody on the same page. And
so Google Docs is our friend, people can comment. No, I'm just saying, or something like that. Yeah.
Some kind of shared space, but it's when we have so many documents to read, I have to take maybe a little of a, I now am a member of something like 80 Slack
Oh yeah, the Slack is getting a bit much, isn't it? You need a Slack aggregator, don't you?
Yeah, so, and the conversations I have, they're saying, well, I posted that. So you go back, how are you going to find it? Yeah. And then once you do find it, how are you going to know all the comments that were made against that specific thing? There's nothing easy about this stuff. We need to simplify.
Yeah, the whiteboard is definitely Trump. Oh, I don't like using that word, but the whiteboard beats Slack in that way for sure.
Yeah,
we've been using Miro for over a year with a group of consultants. We're with 5. We've been using it for a year. Just one board where we just dump and share everything. And
is it a Kanban? Are you seeing flow, or are you just?
No, not even. Just free format. And sometimes we go there with each other, find some form of visual collaboration tool. So everything that's dumped on there, we understand what people are.
So you just leave
it's a shared memory location.
Yeah, it's
shared
just
memory.
It's a bunch of things.
Yeah, because we were already distributed as consultants. We already saw each other once a week for a couple of hours. So we just go there and dump information. And then when we aligned, we talk about it. It's really helpful. Just as a dumping, but just one location is really viable where you can continuously collaborate. Actually,
there's got to be some signal that's being put up because of if I've got to go, and this is usually the case, to many different documents to get a feeling for what's going on. We're working on too much stuff. And this is, I think, something that's really important. I'm going to be really adamant about this. We add too many features to every bit of software we write. We have projects that do way too much. And then we think that our customers need it. We expect our developers to be able to develop it. We have no way to really verify it well until we've got the things in use. And then once something's added, we never take it out. And so things get so complicated over time, we need to figure out how to simplify. The future kind of depends on us not clogging our brains up with all this stuff. Yeah. Right now is a very important time in history for us to be collaborating across borders, across cultures, across the world. When we talk about, the big problems we're trying to solve today, I don't need to mention them. We shouldn't be talking about how are we doing in comparison to someone else. We should be talking about how can we better collaborate with them so we all can be doing better. And I think this goes for software as well, that we have so many different kinds of software packages that are available for the charting, for example. That's good. That shows that we have lots of ideas to use. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not arguing against that. But we also could be collaborating. Hey, this is really working well for us. Here's how we got there. Are we sharing that stuff? This helps the world rather than, competition is a trick we play on ourselves. Collaboration, I think, is going to win us a little bit better result. I'm not sure, let's experiment with that one too, but it's what I found in my own life. Boy, and right now is a great time for it. I've learned so much in the last 2 months because I've been freely doing these little mob programming sessions. Some of you have come to them online. I just say, hey, in a couple hours, I have some free time. Let's get together and mob program. Boy, I've learned so much from people just joining on that.
Yeah. Hanging out and having a discussion on a topic, doing whatever is really very good. I've been involved in a lot of the virtual DDD sessions here that Kenny and folks have been having, and they're very interesting too. So from a collaborative culture like that, it's good amongst people. Getting businesses to line up is another story.
It's also sometimes good to don't have expectations out of your experimentation.
Yeah, that's true.
And see where it ends up.
Which is one of the benefits of what Woody was just talking about. Hey, let's do some mob programming. Not we're trying to accomplish a specific thing.
Yeah. You get 2 hours to see if this works. Okay.
Experiment, Spike.
Yeah.
I can't say to my dog, I'm only going to walk you if you can help me figure out the solution to this problem, right? That's not the way this works.
Paul, does that mean like me, you are talking to yourself on the whole dog walk, talking to the dog?
Generally,
Talking to the dog.
no,
The neighbors are like,
people talk about rubber ducking, but yeah,
Talk to the tomato, the Pomodoro tomato.
whatever it is. Right?
So,
I
yeah,
wanted to say one quick thing. When I was a child, I worked in a plant nursery for about 4 or 5 years when I was in my preteens and into teenage. And they were breeding daylilies or hybridizing daylilies and doing some work with roses. That's a world where you do experiments that take years. And as you work on these things, it's a very slow pace. You cannot force any of the things to happen. You try things, and it's a lot of it's happy accidents. Oh, look at what happened from that. Let's get some more of that. We can use that same idea here. It's not all about how quick we can get to something. It's about what can we try? What
Right.
would be? I think it's a meta thing. Like, let's experiment on how easy we can make it to experiment.
Right, and
So
I
one
think
of
creating a space for those happy accidents, right, is that you have
Right,
to be
that's
Ross.
you have to be intentional about happy accidents.
That's
Yeah.
right.
And you have to have enough space to notice that it's a happy accident that happened.
Yes.
And-
We ignore
and-
the things that happen if we don't.
Yeah.
They're not serving this moment.
So when you're in that mental space, things can happen, and it's something that I don't think I expect myself to always be in that state of experimentation. There are times when I say, well, no, okay. So somebody asked earlier in the chat, how much can you experiment? Well, I think experiments are bounded. One of the things that like the Cynefin folks say is like, well, you should know that you're experimenting for 2 hours doing a mod session, right? We'll figure out a different, but if they're unbounded, then it's not really an experiment. It's just sort of wandering around. So there has to be some constraints on something.
Yeah, absolutely. I think deadlines, self-imposed or not, are a critical part of that. Time boxing. I think of the book Artful Making, where they talk about putting on a play and how consistently theatre troupes are able to hit opening night with a tremendous amount of experimentation and innovation along the way, but they still have to be ready on opening night to deliver the play.
But that's like a newspaper.
Right.
The time you go to press, it's whatever we got ready is going to go. It's
Right.
like 2 weeks from now, this play's going to be different than it was tonight on opening night, because it's going to grow and change.
like
as we
every
get the
conference
experience.
presentation.
I would argue that anyways. What do I know? But I kind of agree with you. The pressure can help, and on the other hand, it can hinder. So we need to be mindful. That's all. We need to be paying attention. When is the pressure good? When is it not good?
So a good one is because it's a polarity, and I've been diving into polarity management by I'm not sure what his name was again, but there's actually a nice visualization tool I'm experimenting with. It's called polarity mapping, where you map both of the polarities. So the good part of the one polarity, the good part of the other, the bad of the other, and then how you act on it. And then you can make a continuous flow, right? If you see, well, I'm getting into usually the bad part on one end, you can counter with the good part on the other end. So that's how you can manage your own polarity, by saying, well, look, okay, we've experimented too much, maybe. Okay, let's go to the other one. So really, I'm diving into that, because polarity cannot be gone. It can only be managed.
That's interesting, because you're talking about things like learned optimism, or can I change what my perception is in order to change what I'm doing. And when I read that, I go, oh man, I never feel worthy enough. I might slide back into, oh, this didn't work, so it's an interesting thing. I like, Kenny, that you're reading all these books, but at some point, I hope you don't have how many books of the year you're going to read. And yes, you do. You have a list, don't you?
Yeah, but I've tried to experiment, because I know it's too much information. And I need to experiment with them, and I need to do it in order to learn from it. I cannot just read it and do nothing.
You know Terry Pratchett, I'm sure. There's some characters in some of his books that are the Macnac Feegle, which are sort of a warring tribe of extremely miniature human-like creatures. They're like 6 inches tall or something, I don't know. But one of the things they say is they love nothing more than being completely surrounded by enemies. Because in no matter what direction I stab, I'm going to kill somebody that I want to kill. And so I kind of like that thought, is that when we surround ourselves with this huge bucket of ideas and thoughts and things, that somehow we're going to get a result that we couldn't get any other way. So I think both of those come together. We don't want to just completely ingest books, but on the other hand, it's nice to have all those, to be floating in a sea of all these ideas. Yeah, I love that. So maybe it's both sides of that. I don't know. I don't care what direction I stab in, I'm going to find something interesting to pay attention to. And I love that.
So I've been experimenting with growing plants in my garden from seed this year because I'm not traveling enough, right? I'm not traveling, so I can have tomato starts.
And that's something that takes a bit of patience.
Yeah.
It's 10 minutes past our time.
Okay.
So we're just getting warmed up.
Yeah, I thought so already. Well, it's almost 12 here. It's almost the next day for me.
It's not quite happy hour here.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed the conversation. So I want to do a quick last checkout, as I always do in the workshops. So just a sentence. So what are your thoughts at the moment? So mine is, I need to do more with the polarity mapping and experimentation. See where the boundaries are of my experimentation, where I get into good and the bad one.
I'm actually thinking, as I'm working with clients, to reshape this thing that Rebecca said that I keep coming back to, which is the experiment spike, right? To kind of build a time boxed experiment, enable people to feel they have, a day or 2 days to go off and work on something if they need to, but not schedule it in like, okay, every Friday you're going to do this, but have the flexibility as needed to be able to take that time to do that.
I keep seeing today, as we've been talking, that we have the things we're talking about, and then there's some layer beyond that, or maybe 2 layers. And that's what's driving me, I think, right now out of this conversation. I want to consider more like, how are we going to think of, let's not just experiment more, how are we going to think about experimenting? And maybe why would we want to experiment? So somehow there's some layers out there I want to dive into.
Anyone else?
Sorry about the barking dog.
Good dog. I think I'd like to try what Woody's doing, as much as it terrifies me, is the idea of doing some public making and, maybe experimenting with some mob programming around the thing that I'm, around virtual hallway tracks and what that can look like, and find some co-conspirators to do that. I think if I could find a way to make it fun, then I could do that.
Sounds like fun.
You can call me anytime, Paul.
Hey,
all right, there we go.
Yeah, if anyone wants to invite me to a remote mobbing session, I'd be happy to do that too. I find that experimenting where you can, share the mental load is a really powerful thing to do.
So the world should listen to what was just said there, Rebecca, because you will get a huge value if you invite Rebecca to your little session. Yeah. If it's 5 people or 10 people, it'll be way more valuable than. So
Woody, when you have one of them, invite me. My time is getting freer over the next.
I'm going to try to remember to invite you. What I've normally been doing is just posting it in Twitter and saying, "Hey, 2 hours from now, I'm going to do this thing." And then
I must have you muted on Twitter.
So
You need
I'll
to
try to
direct
remember
message
to
me.
invite you, but send me a note or two, and then let's go take a virtual walk
We need
with
to
our
do that,
phones
yeah,
in our
yeah.
hand and just talk as we go. I'm missing that a great deal.
Yeah, me too.
So everybody, this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thanks.
Kenny.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to Kenny, you, and Marco and Sophia and all the others that have been involved in putting this together today. And this has been very energizing and encouraging. So I'm very, very grateful.
Get some sleep, Kenny.
Yeah, I'll get some
Yes.
sleep. And I'm very grateful for everyone who participated today. And, you too. So I'm gonna close the stream now. Thank you,
Okay.
everyone.